Yeah, so we have more fun stuff.
Yes. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to LSE for today's hybrid event hosted by the European Institute. This event is part of the European Institute's Beyond Eurocentrism, I can never pronounce the word, event series, which in turn is part of the program under the same name, Beyond Eurocentrism program. This series and the program aims, we want to explore how the shape of Europe and the shaping of Europe, its political economy, its political policy making, its political culture needs to be rethought in time of the exhaustion of Eurocentric ideas. So this event is one of those attempts where we are thinking how to make Europe become understandable to all who come in contact with it. My name is Eva Połońska and I'm a fellow in International Migration and European Politics at the Institute here at the London School of Economics, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming our speakers for today. Emmanuel Achiri, Janine Silga, Martina Tazzioli, our first speakers, plus people who are going to speak later, Hope Barker, Arshad Isakci, Tom Davis, Jelena Obradowicz-Wochnik, Magda, who is not coming in the last panel because of health-related issues, but we have a last-minute entry class Van Deken, who will join us today, and there is also Nadine El-Enani. I've seen her somewhere, so hello and welcome to everyone. I'm also delighted to be joined by my LSE colleagues, Jennifer Melvin, who is coming later to chair one of the sessions, Nina, who's been here somewhere, thank you for coming, Patrick, and Tsarsis from across different departments. I'm also very pleased to welcome our online audience. This event is a hybrid event, so we are joined by people online and also people in the room. So welcome everyone. A few words about the event. On the eve of elections to the European Parliament, and since yesterday we also know the elections are coming here in Britain, migration features high on electoral agendas. So this is the time when the new EU Pact on migration is being put in place. This is the time when Britain is thinking of leaving human rights conventions in order to better protect its borders. So at this time, the LSE European Institute and the Brussels-based European Network Against Racism are joining hands to discuss what it all means for the future of migration, migrants, and the management of all of this. So our event intends to explore how the new lines of exclusion and inclusion drawn in Europe's peripheries, but also on distant shores, distant continents, how all this informs political identity of European nation states and of the European integration project as such. We would like to discuss and find perhaps a couple of answers to the following questions. What role does racialized violence, past and present colonialisms of European states, of the EU itself, play in the management of Europe's borders today? What do we see when we look at Europe's borders from the other side? What kind of relationships does this border create between European states, the EU, and those who attempt to cross the border? What kind of Europe has emerged from its border practices, and what is the border telling us? What is the story that the border is telling us about Europe itself? Before we begin, I would like to make a couple of technical announcements. I would like to ask you to please put your phones on silent, so not to disrupt the event. The event is being recorded, Charlotte is saying, so we are hopefully producing a podcast later on, subject to no technical difficulties. As usual, there will be a chance for you to put your questions to the panelists. For the online audience, you can submit your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And people in the room, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, tell us where you come from, your affiliation, and we will try to address as many questions as possible. Event format. How are we going to go about the event? We have 3 panels, as displayed here on the screen. The first panel on race in Europe's migration law and policy and the experiences with it, followed by lunch break of sandwiches, teas and coffees, Then the second panel on violence in Europe's borders, coffee break. The third panel on externalization of Europe's borders, follow immediately, directly, with no break between the next session, which will be a screening of a film titled The Borders of Paradise. This session will be run by our students, Lauren and Jojo. Thank you for helping out with the event. And we will have a discussion. We'll have half an hour of a film and half an hour of a discussion with the film producer, Zara Golden. Is that you, Zara?
Yeah.
Hello. we haven't met. And after that, we will have wine reception at about 5:30 in the afternoon. It was difficult to arrange the sessions somehow thematically because they overlap and they are linked to one another. So I juggled a lot with putting people into right places, but if someone is not happy, please do not tell me. Because really, how do we separate racism from violence, right? How do we separate policy from practice and from the experiences of those who are subjected to those policies and practices? How do we separate what's happening in here or at the border and out there somewhere where border is currently practiced or implemented? So you will see lots of overlaps. You will see that externalization is also talking about violence, and violence is also talking about racism. So no meaningful division into sessions. Hopefully those of you who are staying the whole day will make more sense out of this. So, and the final announcement, we've been asked by the security people that if you are planning to leave the building for smoke, coffee, or just go out, you need to pick up one of those things which are at this table to show on the way back, so you don't have to be checked again, or if your name will not have to be found on the list. So straight on to the first session and the panel on race in Europe's migration law and policy, which explores how those new laws, what do they mean for migrants in the first place, but also what do they tell us about the nature of European integration and the character of the states that implement them. It discusses how the new norms that migration policies normalize and how migration is racialized and the defense of human rights is increasingly eliminated or criminalized. So we have three excellent speakers. Emmanuel Achiri, who holds a doctorate in international relations with a focus on international law enforced migration. He currently works as a policy and advocacy officer at the European Network Against Racism in Brussels, as a migration policing and security expert. We have more on every speaker. Please take a brochure and read some more information about them. So Emmanuel will speak about, his talk will be called Centering Racism and Colonialism. Oh, here it is. Centering Racism and Colonialism in Europe's Migration Policies. And then Janine, who is an assistant professor in European Union law at the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, Ireland. She was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Luxembourg and also at the University of Venice. I'm really bad at languages. So again, more information about her in the brochure. She will speak today about about the shift from political to migration-based conditionality in the EU development policy. And here's a spoiler alert. She will be concluding that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And the final speaker, Martina Tazzioli, holds a PhD in politics from Goldsmith and master's and bachelor's degree in philosophy from University of Pisa. Before joining the University of Bologna, where she currently works, she was reader in politics and technology at Goldsmiths. She works on 3 research projects at the crossroads of political geography, critical migration and border studies, and political philosophy. So she will talk to us today about border abolitionism, migration containment, and the genealogies of struggles. So, Emmanuel, Janine, Martina, welcome to the Institute. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I think I would make the slides. Okay.
Do you want to come here?
Yeah, I think so. I think it will be impossible for me to see from this angle. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Eva, and good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to be here to represent the European Network Against Racism and to also co-organize this event with the London School of Economics. I'm sure all of us here, we are fully aware of, border violence and, the increase in the racialization of migration and bordering practices. So I'm sure a lot of the things I'll be talking about this morning, you already are fully aware of. So I'll try to be brief in some aspects, and in other aspects, I'll try to be a little bit elaborate. Now, when Eva asked me what I wanted to talk about, this was sometime at the beginning of March. I was in Cyprus on a visit to monitor migration management with two members of the European Parliament and a member of the German Bundestag. And it was such a very tense period, really going to this, detention centers, which are called reception centers. And so I didn't really think too much about what I wanted to say. So I was just like, okay, I'm just going to tell Eva, centering race and colonialism in the EU's, in Europe's migration policies. And so preparing for this, I was like, okay, what am I going to include in this topic? And I think what I finally did at the end of the day was really focus on the work that we do at ENAR in terms of trying to deconstruct Europe's migration policies. Of course, this includes the policies at the level of the European Union, but also the UK and Ireland to an extent. And for us, I think our key message is to really understand mobility. Because of course we talk about migration, but what do we mean by migration? And so sometimes we say mobility, because migration in itself is a very loaded term. Who is a migrant? Who is an expert? So how do we define migration without necessarily giving negative connotations to specific mobile bodies? And so often we prefer to use the term mobility at ENAR. And so for us, is really how it's impossible to understand mobility and attitudes and policy responses towards mobility without first understanding the meaning of borders. So what are borders? I think borders, often we understand borders as, as a given, but borders are not really, they're not abstract terms, Borders mean things to different people. Borders do things to different people. Borders include and exclude in groups and out groups. Borders are race, they are not race neutral technologies. And oftentimes they are also mirrors that reflect particular attitudes, exclusionary attitudes. They are also, in the words of Tendai Akume, who has written a lot on race and border. Borders also are structured by imperial inequity, are inherently racial and privilege wideness, and race often is the operating structure or means of enforcing neo-colonial border structures. And of course, they confer certain rights, they take away certain rights, and yeah, there are technologies of race making in effect. And so to really understand migration governance, sometimes we say migration management, but I think that when we say migration management, it already has a negative connotation. So migration governance, we at ENAR feel that it's really important not only to have race and colonialism as a part of the framework within which or through which we use to analyze borders, but actually race and colonialism should be the centerpiece of our analysis. Oftentimes as well, in the field of migration studies, of course, increasingly we see race and colonialism used as frameworks, but also there is a critique as well that sometimes it is really the tokenization of racism and colonialism, rather than actually looking at them, as a key component, as the main framework through which we should do our analysis. And sometimes you hear in some literature the critique of we should not just use race and colonialism as frameworks, as a way of whitewashing guilt or white guilt or move to innocence. It's about deconstructing in such a way as to offer material benefits to those who have been excluded historically and of course also contemporarily as well. So it's not just a tool to deconstruct and do our analysis and then we move on to and life goes on as usual. I mean, in these days we would see as well in discussions on decoloniality where people talk about Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, and others, and Edward Said. But then, of course, with the genocide in Gaza, you see that even some of the people who teach these courses do not apply the same methodology. I mean, even writers like Walter Mignolo who has written this, outstanding book on decoloniality, has very problematic views on the situation in Gaza. And so this is where we say it cannot be about whitewashing guilt or move to innocence, but it has to be a tool which we continuously use and ensure that material benefits are transferred to certain groups. And so the question I pose to you is, when we look at data sets, when we look at the people who die at borders or at the sea or live in squalid conditions in refugee camps and in detention centers, who do we see? What is the first image? How do these people look like? Which groups do these people belong to? I think that when we look at it from this prism, we also tend to understand who borders include and who borders exclude, and specific kinds of borders. And it's also really important to have racism and colonialism or decoloniality as a tool of analysis because of the discourse that we use. So for example, when we use migration crisis, when we use words like influx, when we use words like wave of migrants, what do these words mean? Do these words ignore a huge part of our history? This sanctioned ignorance, this erasure of moments in our human history that have shaped what we call today as modernity, whatever and however we describe modernity. But how can we ensure that we do not contribute to this erasure and this sanctioning of ignorance that allows us to use terms even in academia, but also in our advocacy work that actually reproduce systems of oppression and systems of exclusion? And when we use this framework of racism and migration, it always takes me back to, this was 2016, just after the displacement from Syria, or when the displacement from Syria was at its peak. There was this colonel, I think it was from Belgium, who wrote this piece in the newspaper saying, well, he described it as a migration crisis. Of course, he wasn't the first to describe it as a migration crisis, but this wave of immigrants is going to be the destruction, of course, wave in quotes, it's going to be the destruction or the end of Europe, similarly to the fall of the Roman Empire. And so I wrote an op-ed challenging this, saying, first of all, what do you mean by the fall of the Roman Empire was as a result of wave of barbarians, as he referred to it. The fall of the Roman Empire was due to structural reasons within the Roman Empire itself. And that also made me, I started thinking as well, when we talk about migration crisis, is it really a migration crisis in quotes, or do we have a crisis of European identity? So I use his analogy in a sense to kind of like, how do we understand Europe's response to movement? How do we understand Europe's response to a specific kind of movement? And this is movement from the global majority, which some people refer to as the global south. I've never understood why, because that's the majority of the world. But I think that's a conversation for some other day. How do we understand Europe's response? And the more I thought about it, you think, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who thinks about it this way, Europe is funding wars all over the globe. You see Europe propping up authoritarian regimes, the continuous exploitation and extraction, so the continuation of colonialism, because we talk about neocolonialism as though the practices are different. No, the practices are not different. We have the same practices that existed in the past. Of course, we can also talk about the dumping of hazardous materials in different parts of the world. And this is even ignoring, to a certain extent, enslavement, and colonialism, which fundamentally changed the structures of the societies. So when you look at this as an Assam, when you look at this as one, and then you look at the response that Europe is having, securitization of mobility, especially securitizing the mobility of racialized groups, of racialized people. So specific groups of people are being racialized and are being excluded and are being securitized. Of course, we have the instrumentalization of migration, which is a key component of the new EU Migration Pact, but also a key component as well of the reform of the Schengen Border Code as well, which happened in April this year. And then, of course, the adoption of really very racist immigration policies. So you look at Europe's response to actions which cause mobility or certain kinds of mobility, which Europe itself is hugely responsible for this. And I think the only answer is to say that Europe is actually going through, we don't have a migration crisis, we have an identity crisis of Europe. And why do I say we have an identity crisis of Europe? Because Europe was built and continues to thrive on an idea of racial superiority and imperial inequality. And because Europe is unable to come to terms with, the horrors of slavery and slave trade, its colonial past, and, refuses to reimagine what it means to be European or what it means to be white, or in some cases, what it means to be British. And at the end of the day, it is really this crisis of identity, this attempt to kind of, I use the word irrelevantize, because I think it makes more sense than saying makes irrelevant. I think it's more stronger to kind of irrelevantize all this erasure which has happened throughout a huge chunk of human history, and this denialism of the persistence of racist structures within European society. I mean, whether it is here in the UK or it's in other parts of Europe, we still see structures that celebrate slavers. We see structures that celebrate even people like Churchill, who was responsible for the deaths of millions of people. We would not see these same kind of representations of people like Hitler, who is also responsible for the deaths of millions of people. We see movies like Napoleon, which is, there was this whole big thing when the new movie Napoleon came about, and this grand conqueror and Napoleon spreading the ideas of fraternity, liberation throughout Europe, but also ignoring as well that Napoleon had played a huge role in the destruction and feminization of Haiti and the deaths of millions of Black people. And so it is really this denialism of really actually admitting that there is a continuation of these racist structures which are integral parts of European identity. And so when you put this denialism on one part, and you put on the other part Europe's supposed attempts to fight structural and institutional racism, and what we have as a response is a schizophrenic approach to migration governance, where on the one hand, you have projects, for example, from the European Commission, which launched a project recently calling for proposals to work on decolonizing migration. So you have the European Commission putting out a project, let's decolonize migration. At the same time, you have the European Commission proposing legislation like the Migration Pact, which racializes and criminalizes migration to Europe. The Schengen Borders Code reform, which literally legitimizes racial profiling. And in September, they are going to open the file for the discussion on the facilitators package, often referred to also as the anti-smuggling package, which in their terminology is fighting smuggling, and so smuggling is a reason for movement to Europe, and basically criminalizing, thank you, I'll try to end very quickly, basically criminalizing not only migration, but organizations that work to support migrants. So you really see that it is not a migration crisis per se, but it is an identity of European it's a crisis of European identity that is also responsible for this schizophrenic approach to migration governance. And of course, we could use the same we could say the same about the UK as well. And so just in terms of like real concrete examples of this happening, I'm not going to go through, the historical practices of, or maybe even before that, I already mentioned it really very briefly, the discourse that we use. So how do we define mobile borders? Who is a migrant, or who is considered a migrant? Who is considered an expert? Who is considered this? What do these terms mean? I think the discourse is really very important. Also, what do these words and how we describe these mobile bodies, what kind of rights do people access and what kind of rights are people excluded from because of the definitions that we use or because of the words that we use? And of course, if you want to look at the historical practices, whether it is, I would say this very briefly. For example, we often say, litigation at the level of the European Court of Human Rights, we need to litigate and challenge some of the migration, the policies in the Migration Pact. But the European Court of Human Rights also has a history of actually perpetuating racialist understandings of migration. So for example, the foundational decision on which the European Court of Human Rights actually bases its decisions on, free movement or sovereign control over borders is actually based on the case of Abdulaziz versus the UK, where you had a group of Indians who took the UK government to court, arguing that, well, their partners had been refused to had been denied entry into the UK. And the court ruled that, well, this was not sufficient ground to say that there was racial discrimination. But when you also look at the Windrush scandal, you see that there was a historical process by the British government to exclude specific groups of people, which was based on racism. And so you have a decision by the European Court of Human Rights, which ignores that the decisions or the policy by the UK government was actually based on racial discrimination. And so you see that it's not only the discourse, but also the practices of our legal institutions as well. When we ignore racism and colonialism as centerpieces of analysis, then you see our legal structures also reproduce the same structures. And just very, to conclude on this, of course, I'll be more than happy to answer some questions as well, on examples, not only, of course, the Windrush scandal, but we can also see the movement of different groups during the post-Second World War period, and how this somehow represents the same kind of movement or similar movements that we see today. But really just briefly on the Migration Pact, because I think this is a huge deal, the Migration Pact and the Schengen Border Code reform. I'm sure you probably already all have an idea on the Migration Pact. Is this reform of the common European asylum system? This was meant to bring, to move away from the ad hoc system to a solidarity-based system, which of course, there is no such thing as solidarity in the Migration Pact, but I'm not going to go into the details. And of course, the Schengen Border Code reform is really about expanding the rules that member states can put in place to control the internal borders. And when you look at the Migration Pact and the Schengen Border Code reform, including the first proposal of the facilitators package, which would be discussed in September because there's a proposal on the table, but then the discussions will start in September, you see that there are certain commonalities. One is that they all betray the spirit of the EU Action Plan Against Racism, because even in the EU Action Plan Against Racism, although migration is not a centerpiece, it acknowledges that migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are susceptible to racial discrimination. But you see in Article 5 of the Screening Regulation of the Migration Pact and Article 23A of the Schengen Border Code reform basically actually gives law enforcement the right not only to stop and check people at the borders in the name of controlling migration, but also would give law enforcement the right to stop and search people within the territories of the member states in order to control irregular migration. And the question is, who are those who are stopped and searched by law enforcement? And when we look at recent results, recent findings of the Fundamental Rights Agency, we will see that 80% of people who are stopped and searched are racialized people. And we see that there has been an uptick from 2016. About 57% of people who have been stopped and searched, or racialized people who have been stopped and searched, have said this as a result of ethnic and racial bias. And yet you have new legislation which has been adopted at the level of the European Union, which legitimizes racial profiling and racial discrimination. And so you see this schizophrenic response, this schizophrenic attitude. Of course, the Ukraine response. Yeah, I'm going to end like in 1 minute and a half. You can look at the Ukraine response, and the Ukraine response, or the response to displacement from Ukraine was really very, I think it was one of those moments where we could see the racism laid bare, where you had EU policymakers saying, well, these are not the same types of refugees. They have blue eyes. They worship the same gods that we worship. They share the same culture that we share. And so you could see that the response was based on this same idea of racism, of racial discrimination. And then when you compare that to the Migration Pact and to the other policies, you see a complete different response: securitization, detention, and the use of AI and technologies to kind of like, exacerbate racial discrimination. Of course, I think there's one of the panelists will be speaking about the UK-Rwanda deal, so I'm not going to go into that. I just want to highlight that 2 days ago, the Lighthouse report released. Data dumps. I actually invite you to check out this report, because this report actually shows what the EU's money is used in Mauritania, in Morocco, and Tunisia, and how this money is used to actually fuel racial discrimination and the deaths of asylum seekers and refugees. And the last but not the least point, which is really very important, because when we criticize the Migration Pact and the new legislation, the response is always, well, we are providing safe and legal pathways to Europe. And one of them is labor migration. And I think the fundamental problem with labor migration as a solution is it actually continues extractivist and colonialist responses to migration, where Europe is saying that we do not want migrants or this kind of migrants, but we want you if we need your labor. So it is not about the dignity of the person, it is really about labor. And it continues a practice of extractivism, and also leads to brain drain as well from where these mobile bodies are coming from. And so you'd see basically here why we at ENAR say there is no such thing as a migration crisis. What we have is a crisis of European identity. And when we center race and colonialism as foundational frameworks from which to look at migration governance, then we see that there is a need for a structural reform or structural approach to migration, which has to be fundamentally different from what we have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you so much for your invitation and for your very kind introduction. So thank you very much to all of you for attending this panel. Thanks again also to Emmanuel for your excellent and comprehensive introduction into today's event. So you will spare me from saying many things right now. So just before moving to my presentation as such, I would like to start with a little anecdote. So do not worry, it is connected to today's event. So when Eva first invited me, she mentioned that I would be part of this panel on race in Europe's migration law and policy, and I was eager obviously to present the chapter on which I'm currently working on migration-based conditionality as part of the EU development policy. But after I sent my abstract to Eva, you came back to me. So Eva came back to me, and she told me that in light of the fact that actually my abstract did not include, not even once, the term race, you are no longer sure whether this could be actually part of this panel. So I totally agreed with you. My title could have been misleading, and to be fully honest, I had not even changed one word of the abstract of my book chapter before sending it to Eva, so fair enough, and this very well could explain the misunderstanding. So after Eva expressed her doubts, and very rightfully so, I slightly changed my abstract and included the notion of hierarchies, and all of a sudden, I mean, you are relieved that my paper could actually be part of this panel, and here I am right now. So This anecdote is probably something that happens very often within academic life, and I did not pay very much attention to it actually at first. But after a few weeks, this small anecdote made me realize that something very important, which also helped me to reframe my book chapter in a deeper way. So thank you very much for that, Eva. So for me, actually, the simple mention of colonialism and the persistence of colonialism within the EU policies implicitly referred to racism, and because I found it back then, I also find it now impossible to disentangle European colonialism from racism. However, this small anecdote, so this exchange that we've had with Eva, made me realize something crucial, and it was precisely that racism is the missing link, in the sense of implicit missing link between the colonial legacies that we find in the EU development policies and the introduction of mechanisms such as migration-based conditionality. So before diving into it, I'm aware that racism is, of course, a much debated notion. So, Emmanuel, you started talking about it. It relies on the unscientific but socially constructive and therefore a very much socially active notion of race. So in my presentation, I'm especially focusing on one aspect of racism, which is the sense in which racism always postulates a form of human hierarchy, or hierarchies between humans. So in other words, while it is true that racism actually means that some humans are inferior to others, it is unclear whether this inferiority is a permanent state or where exactly on the hierarchy of humans one may be. So the hierarchy that is at the heart of racism is also replicated within the field of development, and through the classification of countries, which are basically a collective of humans according to their supposed level of development. So through this lens, it is not surprising at all that most of the so-called least developed countries are actually African countries that also used to be European colonies. So there is no doubt about the colonial origins of the EU development policies, but the racism that lies at the root of the colonial project itself does not always appear in a way that is clearly highlighted in the relevant scholarship. So this was after the realization that our exchange prompted. So this criticism can be generalized to the whole field of development studies, so beyond the EU. And this has been mentioned especially by one author, who is Uma Kothari, who has questioned the invisibility or the silence that exists around race in development in a 2006 article. So you can see one excerpt of it on the slide, and I come back in a minute. So in this article, Uma Kothari was wondering whether the silence or the invisibility that exists around race might be explained by the fact, so here I quote her, that within a discourse framed around humanitarianism, cooperation and aid, raising race is too distracting, disrupting and demanding, or, as she went on to ask, does the silence that exists around race within the field of development conceal the complicity of development with racialized projects, in a way that, for instance, the migration-based conditionality can illustrate? So to this question, this author replies, so you can read this excerpt on the slide, that this concealment of race within development is founded upon the assumption that development takes place in non-racialized spaces and outside of racialized histories. And furthermore, she adds that the silence about race, the concealment of its effects, and the complicity of development with racialized projects are intimately connected. So in my view, when looking both at the EU migration policy and at the EU development policy, or what is left of this policy, racism really becomes an obvious and evident part of the equation. So today I will limit myself to focusing on this one field, which is, I will briefly address migration-based conditionality. I hope I won't go too much into the details. And migration-based conditionality, as I will show, has become an inevitable aspect of the EU migration policy and also of what is left of the EU development policy. And this is especially visible in the relationship between the EU and the so-called ACP countries, so African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, where the development policy of the EU actually originates, and this is especially true in the relationship between the EU and African countries as part of this framework. But before that, I will very briefly outline how the colonial origins of the EU development policies have been acknowledged within the literature, the scholarship, and also how racism is as part of the EU migration policy. So Dr. Achiri already mentioned that in great length, so I won't go too much in depth, but we will see very, very briefly a couple of authors who have highlighted how racism is a part of the EU migration policy. So the colonial origins of the EU development policies cannot give rise to any doubts. So this has been consistently acknowledged and emphasized by many scholars. So to be more precise, the so-called association between the European colonies and the European Economic Community, so going back to the late 1950s. So this originated from the French insistence to prolong its own constitutional structure that it had established after the Second World War as a way to renew its relationship with its colonies at the time. So this effort to prolong this relationship within the context of the European community. So in this respect, Emily Marker, so historian Emily Marker, has very convincingly, in my view, highlighted how metropolitan French policy makers have framed, so here I quote her, the colonialist racism as being fundamentally un-French back then. So this was after the Second World War, and this was a part of an effort, and here I quote her again, an effort to obscure the way in which race actually worked in post-war Greater France by encouraging the perception that race lived in individual hearts and minds rather than in institutions, everyday practice, and social relations. So this association between European colonies or former European colonies, if we have to speak from this angle right now, and the European community at the time, so this association also has to be contextualized in the prevalence of the notion of Eurafrica, so as it existed back then. So this is a notion which conceptualized a form of common management of European possessions in Africa. So Guy Martin has summarized it in the following way. The ideology, sorry, I quote him, the ideology of Eurafrica is a body of thought originating in the colonial period according to which the fate of Europe and Africa is seen as being mutually and inextricably linked at the political, economic, social, and cultural level. So since then, there has been the much acclaimed work by Pio Hansen and Stephen Johnson. So probably many of you have already had a look at it. So they have shown how this ideology of Eurafrica was a crucial dimension of European integration. Véronique Dimier has also highlighted how the creation of the EU development policy in particular consisted in a form of survival strategy of the colonial rule and perhaps most importantly of the colonial administration that had to reinvent itself after or before and after the decolonization process. So more recently we can also mention works by Raël Sebhatou and Olivia Ruta-Zibois, and there are even more pressing calls for an epistemic post and anti-colonial deconstruction of the notion of development. So a long line of acknowledgement of the colonial origins of the development policy. But now, in spite of that, racism, it is true, does not usually feature in a way that is so straightforward. So this is actually a finding which I made quite recently, thanks to you, Eva. So this may be because for some, and I would include myself as part of them, racism is an intrinsic part of European colonialism, and for this reason, it constitutes also an implicit component of the EU development policy. So this is one interpretation, or the other interpretation, because this is implicit, so this is missing in this sense, may also be because of a reluctance actually to tackle this issue head-on, and your presentation, Emmanuel, actually illustrates this in a way that is very clear. So now the problem is that not including racism in the conversation becomes untenable when we want to connect development to migration. So when looking at the EU migration policy, especially, what can be at best implicit within, while examining the EU development policy becomes obvious. So this is what you said, Emmanuel. And the criticisms about racism has been expressed that is expressed in the EU migration policy has been voiced increasingly among scholars. So you mentioned the very much acclaimed article by Itabe on border, racial border. And here I have also referred to my speaker poll. So this is an article 2018 in which he mentioned that migration law is actually a form of racial discrimination. And here he relies on the definition of racial discrimination that is provided in the SARS, the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, but there are other authors. So there would be also Marie-Bénédicte Dambourg, so in relation to the case of the ECHR, for instance, or even before all of them, John Torpey, who mentioned that one important consequence of regional integration in Europe has been the heightened attentiveness to racial distinctions. So at least on the part of the guardians of the border, but it probably goes beyond that. So keeping this background in mind, I will now try to illustrate how racism has been permeating EU development policy through the so-called migration-based conditionality. So now to go back to the notion of migration-based conditionality and how it can be connected to racism, so in the sense of a hierarchy of humans, it is important, I would say, to first explain very briefly what conditionality is about. So the notion of conditionality transcends the EU context, and so it is inherent in development aid, broadly understood. So before conditionality emerged as what we call political conditionality within the EU, this concept was rooted in macro-financial assistance and the structural adjustment policies that have been imposed by the so-called Bretton Woods institutions upon developing countries, and that were debt-ridden back then. So it was in the early 80s especially. So now, so this was a form of policy conditionality imposed by Bretton Woods, World Bank, IMF, and so on. So the emergence of political conditionality has actually carried on with this policy conditionality, but it has refocused on the priority of this conditionality on the promotion of different values, so democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, among others, but especially those, and also the prevention against attacks to these values. So this has also initiated within the EU framework the rights-based approach to development, and that was actually confirmed in the Maastricht Treaty in the early 90s. So political conditionality has been said to rely on a carrot and stick approach, so in the sense that it can be both defined in positive terms and in negative terms. So on the one hand, what we call usually positive conditionality aims at promoting compliance by non-EU countries in this context, mainly by providing financial and technical assistance. And on the other hand, negative conditionality intends rather to punish the violation of the political norms that I have mentioned by imposing economic sanctions or by suspending specific economic or financial benefits that rely on usually on a human rights clause, for instance. So I will come to that in a minute. So there are actually three main ways into political conditionalities materializes, so especially within the EU framework. So the first one is through the introduction of these so-called human rights clauses in international agreements. So very interestingly for us today, the very first human rights clause was inserted in the Lomé IV agreement or convention that was signed in 1989 between those ACP countries, so African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, and the EU. And since then, this clause has been enforced overwhelmingly towards African countries. So this is a fact, no creation here. This is actually what happened with political conditionality. So the second way in which conditionality can materialize is also in connection with trade preferences. So this would be, for instance, the case of the EU generalized system of preferences. So I won't say more for now on that. And finally, perhaps on the more punitive side, economic sanctions, so including individual sanctions on the basis very often on UN resolutions, can also be a way to enforce conditionality in this political sense. So just to very briefly summarize, as a policy, conditionality in general aims at rewarding compliance and at punishing a lack of compliance to some norms, so may they be political or migration norms, as we'll see in a minute. So the logic that is used in political conditionality is exactly the same that the EU is currently being using as part of what we can call migration-based conditionality. So in the context of migration, the notion of conditionality can be broadly defined. So in line with what I just said in connection to political conditionality, can be broadly defined as a fact for the EU to leverage different instruments, so may they be political, economic, or financial, to lead third countries to comply with certain norms on migration management. So I will keep this word here, if you don't mind. So these norms, because they are rather negative, are mostly related to the readmission of nationals. It could be also the readmission of non-nationals, assistance to return nationals, and also the prevention of irregular immigration. So those are usually the policy terms that are being used. So while migration-based conditionality might appear as a deviation from what might be perceived as a more righteous form of conditionality, that is political conditionality, in reality they use exactly the same methodology, the same tool, and both of them, most importantly, rely on the same asymmetric power dynamics for the materialization of their objectives. So in this sense, migration-based conditionality has been building, we can say that it has been building upon the institutional framework supporting political conditionality. So very briefly on how this notion of migration-based conditionality has been emerging within the EU system. So initially there was a reluctance from the European Commission to adopt this migration-based conditionality, and that was pushed forward by the European Council in the early years 2000. But after the adoption or the initiation, the emergence of the global approach to migration and mobility, so in the mid-years 2000s, and through the introduction of the more for more principle, a certain form of conditionality, what we might see as a more positive side, started to be introduced. So basically consisting in the way to reward third countries, those third countries that were willing to comply with EU norms in terms of migration management. So they would be rewarded for their efforts in this sense. So the turning point was in the so-called crisis that occurred in 2015-2016, which finally gave rise to a fully fledged approach to conditionality, so including in its negative sense. And here I would like just to mention one instrument that was adopted by the European Commission in 2016, the new partnership framework, in which the European Commission stated in a way that was unambiguous at the time, so here I quote it, that the EU was ready to provide greater support to those partner countries which make the greatest effort, so perpetuating the more for more principle, without shying away from negative incentives. So this threat actually was materialized in the visa code that was amended in 2019, and it included a new Article 25A. And this approach was also afterwards confirmed both in the new pact on migration and asylum, but especially for what concerns us today in the so-called post-Cotonou or the Samoa agreement that was concluded between the ACP countries, once again Africa, Caribbean and Pacific countries, and the EU. And the signature of this agreement started in November of last year. So just to say a couple of words on each, so that really I will be short, I promise. So what is this Article 25A of the Visa Code about? So under this new, it's no longer that new, this provision of the Visa Code provides for the suspension of some provisions of the Visa Code that are deemed to be more favorable to visa applicants, so pertaining, for instance, to the amount of visa fees or to the possibility to be given multiple entry visas. So this provision provides for the suspension of those provisions a bit more favorable to these applicants against countries that are deemed to be non-cooperative when it comes to complying with those migration management norms. So far, this approach has just been, I shouldn't say that, has been adopted towards the Gambia in 2021. So Gambia has been probably under the focus on the EU for that. And very recently, in April this year, it has been also implemented towards Ethiopia. So there have been also some proposals for Bangladesh, Iraq from 2021, but so far nothing has come to materialize, and also towards Senegal in 2022. We'll see what happens. So very briefly, when talking about migration conditionality within the framework of the cooperation of the EU and the ACP countries, so as part of the Samoa Agreement, which is the newer contractual framework of partnership, or this partnership or relationship between the EU and ACP country, we find Article 74 of this agreement, which reads in a very cryptic way, so you can read with me, that if a party considers that another party has failed to respect the time limit referred to in Annex 1 in line of Standard 5.26 of Chapter 5, Annex 9 to the Convention on International Civil Aviation, this party shall notify the other party accordingly, and if that other party continues to fail to comply with those obligations, the notifying party may take proportionate measures starting as from 30 days of the notification. So, as usual, a very complex, let's say, formulation to say something very simple. So to refer to this provision of the Chicago Convention, actually, whereby a contracting state to this convention is supposed to facilitate the return of its nationals. So now this is really entrenched within the Samoa Agreement. So this has always been a bone of contention, so readmission and border management as part of the cooperation between the ACP and the EU. And now I would say that the EU has managed to secure compliance, at least I would say in theory, with ACP countries. So now, to conclude very briefly, once again, so we can say that the inclusion of migration-based conditionality in the cooperation framework between the EU and the ACP countries, in which political conditionality also originates. So this illustrates and confirms the enduring post-colonial asymmetry of the EU development cooperation, and this also illustrates and confirms at the same time racism in terms of access, a hierarchical access to freedom of movement depending on where you are in this hierarchy of humans. So as things currently stand, we cannot be very optimistic about the way in which migration-based conditionality will evolve, because actually there has been some projects to include migration-based conditionality as part of the GSP, so the Generalized System for Preferences. I mentioned that very briefly. So this is just a proposal, so hopefully this can be blocked, but this is something which might extend in the future. So I won't speak more for now. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm sorry that probably my presentation won't be that much focused on laws. I will shift attention a bit away from that. And I've been asked to speak today about border abolitionism, which is also the title of my book, Border Abolitionism, Migration Containment, and the Genealogies of Struggles. And what I'm saying today partly stems from the book and partly from an article that I co-authored with Nicola Zegenova called Border Abolitionism, Analytics and Politics that came out last year. So what I would like to discuss in the frame of this event is the idea behind border abolitionism and in which way an abolitionist grid, analytical grid, might be helpful for re-articulating a critique of the border regime. So there are two main points that I would like to raise as starting points that were also, in a way, the reason why I decided to write a book on that topic. The first one is a kind of political reason that concerns the escalation, the blatant escalation of border violence, progressive escalation of border violence since 2015, that has led many researchers, but also journalists, to reframe their investigation along the line of the production of evidence, right? The piling up of evidence about the violation of international law, the blatant violation in some cases of international law by EU member states, and that in a way has, however, confronted us with a progressive anesthetization of this, in front of this production of evidence, right? Also considering the fact that, yes, on the one hand, there have been multiple clear violations of international law, but on the other, there have been also an ability by states to readapt themselves by enforcing new laws that allow them not to be totally outside the law. And what I mean, for instance, if you think about the recent EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, the non-entry fiction, right, that in fact allows countries like Italy, or better, encourage countries like Italy and Greece not to identify migrants as soon as they land, in order, and we can say, okay, good, they are not fingerprinted, but actually this kind of legal fiction allows states to enforce arbitrary power, and this illegal fiction, fiction of non-entry, was de facto put in practice, for instance, by Greece much before the introduction of the pact. So Greece, for quite a lot of time after the outbreak of the pandemic, the Greek authorities used not to take fingerprints in Lesbos as soon as migrants landed, in order then to have more leeway for pushing migrants back to Turkey. So there is this ability by the states to act on the edge of the law more than just simply outside the law. And so there is, in my view, this need of thinking seriously. What does it mean to articulate a critique of the border regime nowadays in front of this overproduction of evidence, but also inability to produce what Deleuze and Foucault in their works on the prison information group called the production of active intolerance. And on a more theoretical level, my work and this book is grounded my background is connected to the autonomy of migration approach, and what I reflected on is the kind of lack of dialogue, in a way, surprising lack of dialogue until very recently, between the autonomy of migration theory, autonomy of migration approach, and abolitionist views, in particular carceral abolitionism, with, of course, few exceptions. An important exception was an article published by Sandro Mezzadra in 2020 in Citizenship Studies, and of course many critical feminist geographers who in the US, among which, for instance, Jenna Lloyd, used abolitionist analytics for radically challenging the existence of the immigration detention in the US, but precisely by focusing specifically on immigration detention. So instead, I think that abolitionism can be widened as a grid for articulating a critique of the border regime, and not simply of borders, that moves beyond the debate, the long-standing debate between no borders and open borders. Open borders that, an open border debate that started in the late 80s and that has been criticized by no border scholars as a liberal perspective, right, on borders, while no borders scholars and activists engage in a more, if you want, radical critique of the structural violence that percolates and that underpins border violence, and that is also characterized by, of course, an anti-capitalist view on migration. So for me, what is interesting in terms of putting together these two literature, right, autonomy of migration and abolitionism, is precisely the possibility and the need of rethinking a critique of the border regime, which is not only in terms of like denying and abolishing, but in terms of the need of putting in practice, putting in place transformative practices. In fact, I would like to clarify that for me, border abolitionism is absolutely not coterminous with nor narrow to calls for abolishing borders. And it entails thinking and enacting war-making practices that connect struggles against multiple racial bordering mechanisms with mobilization for social justice. And in fact, the reason why for me this is an important point is because abolishing borders, if by borders we mean national frontiers, means very little unless we do not undo the condition under which the reproduction of heterogeneous bordering mechanisms, which exceed by far, of course, national frontiers. Think about the asylum system, think about the bureaucratic conundrums and paper trails that haunt migrants. And as long as a critique of the border regime is not situated within anti-racist and anti-capitalist project. And this is also because, of course, there is a huge heterogeneity of borders, not only because, as of course, Balibar said a long time ago, borders are ubiquitous, but also because there are many borders that migrants are not supposed to cross, but that haunt migrants, like digital invisible borders. And so in what I'm doing as part of this project, research project on abolitionism, is to go back not only to the anti-slavery abolitionism in order not to, of course, reduce abolitionists to a catchword, and to see how these anti-slavery abolitionist legacies have shaped the work of feminist carceral abolitionist scholars such as Angela Davis and Ruth Gilmore, for whom it's very clear that abolitionism has very little to do with the mere act of undoing and demolishing. But, as Angela Davis famously stated, an abolitionist approach does not consist only in tearing down, but also in building up. And of course, the problem here is what does building up mean in relation to borders. And in this respect, it's important to retrace where this argument pushed forward by scholars such as Ruth Gilmore and Angela Davis, but even others come from. And it comes from the work of W.B. Du Bois and his the notion, the concept that he introduced in the Black Reconstruction of America of abolition democracy, in which he famously argued the abolition of slavery, the end of slavery didn't happen with the abolition of chattel slavery in the US, right? But what is needed is, this laborious work of putting in place counterpowers and counter institutions. And this is a term that Angela Davis borrows, right, from Du Bois, precisely for stressing, like many other feminist carceral abolitionist scholars, that what is at stake is not simply decarceration, but is reorganize how we live our life together in the world, right? So from this point, if we take border abolitionism from that point of view, I conceive it as an analytical political gaze that strives for dismantling the material and political conditions under which the multiplication and persistence of heterogeneous bordering mechanisms appears as a condition for people's safety and economic prosperity. For me, there are two key points that such an analytical gaze help us looking at with respect to migration and more precisely the violence of the border regime. The first one is what I call the confinement continuum that pushes to, in a way, stretch an abolitionist approach beyond an exclusive focus on detention and borders, right? In fact, what migrants experience along their route and also along their journey and also upon arrival, right, so to say, is this continuum of violence that is perpetuated through the enforcement and the opening of hybrid spaces, right, in which they are at times hosted or contained as asylum seekers, in other cases are as risky subjects, Of course, I can mention some of these: hotspots, refugee camps, accommodation centers, but even more hybrid sites from a legal point of view, such as centers that have been recently open in southern Italy and that replaced, in a way, hotspots, and where there is even more leeway for discretionary power than in the hotspots, right? And however, this confinement continuum is not only a matter of like geographical size, multiplicity, right? This heterogeneity of geographical size, but it's also a matter for me of understanding how, again, to articulate a critique to size spaces that in some cases are not characterized by total, full detention, right? Officially are not characterized as detention site, and where migrants' mobility is not fully blocked, is not fully mobilized. And a clear example for me is what is happening in Greece, in Greek refugee camps, where I've been doing my research since 2016. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Greek context, after the opening, the implementation of the hotspot system in 2015, there have been many transformations, right? These centers have been transformed not only on a logistical level, practical level, but also in a way at the level of administrative practices through which migrant lives are governed. And the pandemic has been a shifting point in the sense that migrants have been subjected to a protracted and discriminatory lockdown. And of course, at that time, many of us, many researchers and journalists started to denounce this condition of protracted lockdown, and also to, lay bare this emerging, or at least strengthened, carcerality of immigration in Greece, in light of the implementation of new, what the European Commission has called high-tech camps, right? In particular on the island of Samos, Leros and Kos, and in the following months, probably even Lesbos will be, there is this new camp under construction. And of course, this critique is extremely important and needed. And however, what it kind of sidelines is the fact that, in fact, since 2022, when the protracted lockdown kind of like came to an end, a lot of liberal concessions have been made by the Greek authorities. So that kind of critique is no longer valid in the same way that could be mobilized in 2020, right? Because people are allowed to go out during the day. They have kind of more freedom, right? And so, and this is also the tactical way in which the Greek authorities responded to that criticism, in the same way that they responded to the fact that the Moria hotspot was overcrowded, right? And after that Moria was set on fire in September 2020, the new camp is less crowded, right? And so in front of that, how do we articulate a critique when we are confronted actually with in my view, I mean, this is a crucial point for me, an increasing obstruction, active obstruction in migrant social reproduction activities in camps and beyond camps, right? By obstruction of social reproduction activities, I refer to the fact that migrants, for instance, are not allowed to cook their own food, their own meal in the camp, but they are not even given water, drinkable water, depending on their legal status and depending whether or not they are considered vulnerable. And this way of dismantling life support infrastructures, for me, the novelty is that has become a political technology for governing migration, and it's not just a side effect of border violence. And this is something that really, sometimes is marginalized in the critique of the muscular violence exercised and enforced by European states, by the UK as well. So I think that this attention to the fact that migrants are governed by making migrants sick, psychologically and physically, is something that pushes us to revisit and to rearticulate a radical critique of the border regime that is not focused on detention and borders as national frontiers only. And the second aspect, so this I just mentioned the confinement continuum, the abolition is in a way genealogy, right, and literature, body of literature push us, and for me this is also an important point of encounter between, in a way, autonomy of migration and abolition is to look not simply at at migrant struggles and putting the migrant subjectivity at the core, but also to look at the memory and the temporality of this struggle. So how the memory of and the circulation, right, over time of past struggles that are not necessarily migrant struggles, are also struggles for other social justice claims, shaped current mobilization. And this is, for me, as I said, an important point of connection, because until recently, these two bodies of literature have remained partially detached because they had quite different analytical focus. In the case of abolitionism, the main focus is criminalization, right, and the criminalization of racialized population. While in the autonomy of migration literature, despite the criticism, the attempt to challenge, right, this migration-centered analysis, of course, the focus has always been on the migrants, right? On the making of migration, the production of, the legal production of migrants' illegality. Putting at the core this level of the memory of struggles of against interlocking forms of subordination, not only migrant struggles, first of all allows us to unsettle this migration-citizen divide, right? But not in abstract terms, but by looking at partially, similar claims, right? Yes. And second, to, in a way, putting the question of before, of course, the colleagues who spoke before me put the question of race at the core, and colonial legacies. And however, I think that the point is how to, look at the not simply, at the continuity in terms of politics of domination and subordination, but also how this kind of continuity that, however, is never linear, emerge also if we look as, one of the pioneer scholars of the autonomy of migration argued, Yamoulié-Boutang, in his seminal book, The L'Esclavage au Salariat, that was published back in 1998, to put the question of bridal labor, what he defines as bridal labor, at the core by looking at how forms of, the forms like the current free wage labor is in fact, an exception in the history of forms of coerced labor that allows us to see how practices of resistance and escapes that enacted by slaves, but also by other kinds of subordinated workers, the coolies, and by migrant workers, have characterized this long history of attempt to escape, right, the control over workers' mobility. 2 minutes, okay. What does it mean to think about building up practices at the border, and in which sense an abolitionist approach, I think, allows us to shift the attention from this production of evidence and reproduction, in a way, of the border spectacle. I think that for me, what is relevant nowadays, in particular by being based in the southern European context, is the fact that, of course, the narrative of migrant invasion is still there, and it comes back anytime that there is, there's a crisis, right, at the borders in places like Lampedusa or Lesbos, but actually, what the kind of discourse that persists and is more difficult to undermine is what I call in the book the so-called zero-sum rights game, according to which migrants' access to rights and jobs goes to citizens' detriment, right? So this kind of logic unveils what I call a destructive logics of right, which is predicated on a politics of scarcity, right? And it's precisely this politics of scarcity that I think is what need to be undermined, and that allowed to, in a way, showing not only potential connection, but also actual similarities and affinities in struggles for social justice that exceed by far, this essentialization of the figure of the migrants, and that, however, require us to situate our claims for the freedom of movement and the right to mobility within a non-individualistic and non-liberal framework, and to rethink this freedom of movement as part of broader struggle for what scholars have called the mobile commons, but also a broader struggle for social justice. And I would like to conclude by saying that I have also some reservation about simply transposing, right, the abolitionist grid into the European context, that's where I'm doing my research, of course, because I think it's important to analyze, not only the genealogy of abolitionism, but also in which specific political historical context it emerged. For this reason, I think it's important more and more to multiply abolitionist genealogies, having in mind, right, the context that we are studying. Reason why, what I've been doing in the last year is to try to articulate and intertwine these abolitionist genealogies that I spoke about with other more hidden abolitionist genealogies that shaped, however, mobilization in Europe for a radical critique of institutions of violence. And what I have in mind, and what I more specifically focus on, is the movement that between the late 60s and early 70s emerged in Italy and in France, even in other countries in Europe, but I started in Italy, against a psychiatric hospital led by Franco Basaglia, and psychiatrists that, for me, represent a very important point of inspiration for the way in which he moved beyond, in a way to simplify the opposition between reform and revolution, right? By stating that the fight against psychiatric hospital that was successful because psychiatric hospital closed in Italy in 1978 couldn't start and couldn't be carried on only by pushing for shutting down psychiatric hospital, but require reorganizing the whole society and putting in place transformative practices. He argued the struggle against psychiatric institution could not be narrowed to a no model, and it should be rather impose itself as an anti-model, right? Of course, I have no time here. It's important to stress the differences between camps, prison, and asylum, and the kind of different violent institutions that are at stake. But for me, what is important is this push for, moving beyond this binary opposition between reform, right, non-reformist reform, and revolutionary claims, in particular in a moment when I think we have been witnessing in the last few years an important transformation when, struggles that until very recently were considered like charity interventions or humanitarian intervention are nowadays extremely political. And this is connected to what I've said before. So the struggle for allowing migrants and non-migrants to carry on autonomous social reproduction activities is absolutely a central and political struggle. So what does it mean to envision a counter-politics on migration? Not framing migration as a problem entails exposing, I argue, the unequal and racialized right to desire where, the aspiration, where to live, showing that this doesn't concern migrants only. That is a counter-politics on migration undermines the containerization of migration as a self-standing object towards questioning, by questioning the destructive logic of rights, which multiplies degrees of undeservingness and also degrees of denizenship. And I think that this counter-politics, this act of building up, but I know I have no time to explain this, has been also put in place by migrants and people who act in solidarity with migrants, who have, created this kind of very precarious temporary infrastructures for supporting their movement, but also, most importantly for me, for allowing this reconstruction of life support infrastructure of social reproduction.
Thank you so much for all your wonderful interventions. It's really bad to say we are out of time. So maybe I'll skip my questions because I'll have a chance to talk to you over coffee. Charlotte, do we have questions from the online audience so we can give? No? Any questions from the room?
Yes, hello.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, so can you hear me or?
Not quite.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for organizing also this conference. I think it comes at a very important time, especially for our university when it comes to addressing racism and to address structures of racism. And I wanted to react to what our first speaker has said about language. And especially about how language is basically power. And not only is it power, it perpetuates systems of oppression through the very terminology that we use. And I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about what has been happening in this institution and the legitimizing of a certain language that contributes to both sidism and to the neutralization of systems of oppression. So basically, this institution has repeatedly invited individuals that have been openly racist or that have promoted a very racist agenda, Islamophobic agenda, Arabophobic agenda, Palestinianophobic agenda. And it was said in a way that it would promote freedom of speech. And the issue with that is that the freedom of speech has been instrumentalized to really protect the feelings of the oppressor rather than protect the humanity of the oppressed. And I want us to open the discussion on how this institution can do better and not use an event such as this one to really whitewash its deeply racist narrative when it comes to the genocide in Gaza, which it has repeatedly refused to call as such, or at least to engage in that discussion. And so I would like you to react to that and to explain to us how it's crucial, especially at that time when every single university in Gaza has been bombarded and students do not have a voice, so we have the responsibility to be the voice for them, how we can ensure that the university doesn't use this event to whitewash its racist narrative, and so that we can advance and structurally rethink how we approach race and how race and there's intersectionality with racism, but also settler colonialism and genocide. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we have maybe two more questions? And I apologize if we eat into the lunch break because I took so much time in the morning. So, are there any other questions? So, Emmanuel.
Thank you for a brilliant commentary, assessment, and a follow-up question as well. I also think as well that the response to your question also lies in your commentary, in the sense that I think you've assessed properly, and of course it's not only the London School of Economics, we've seen this globally as well, but also by human rights organizations and global institutions. And I'd really invite you and others to read the literature on the move to innocence, especially in decolonial literature, about how we use human or supposed human rights language as not as a tool to actually fundamentally change society, but as a way of whitewashing our guilt. And I would also invite you as well to the words of Frantz Fanon, who, when he talks about liberation and about struggle, says, well, this liberation is not an abstract idea. At the end of the day, it's about the material goods that the oppressed can get at the end of the liberation. So it's not just about talking about these things, it's about what are the material goods that the oppressed class or the oppressed group can get out of it. Of course, I did not get a chance to mention it as well, but I was really very proud to see that there's an encampment on campus, and sad as well that the GDPR was used as a tool to ask me not to take a picture of the encampment, because the GDPR is about individual rights, and the university should have no right to say, well, you should send an email to a certain individual to ask about the right to take a picture, because the GDPR doesn't have rules regards to that. So I think it speaks as well to your point about how institutions that of course preach and promote, on the one hand, decolonization and anti-racist literature and anti-racist movements. But when it really matters, when people's lives are at stake, when people's dignity is at stake, when what makes us human is at stake, we see the move to innocence, what we see at the end of the day. And it's the same thing as well, which I think I mentioned at the beginning when we are talking about discourse and we are talking about centering racism and decoloniality as tools of analysis in migration, but as tools of analysis in human rights literature and human rights practices. Is how do we move away from just whitewashing guilt to actually ensuring that they transfer material goods. So thank you again for bringing this up, and I hope I was able to kind of like address. But I think lastly, I would say it is on us to also hold institutions accountable. I mean, when you look at the history of change, of revolution, however we want to qualify it, has never really come from institutions. It has come from people who are outside of institutions. And so I think that when we also talk about law and we talk about policies, these instruments of social organizations do not implement themselves, do not enforce themselves. We actually have to ensure that those who have the power to enforce it, enforce them. And that is where we come in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have some other questions?
Just a very quick question to Professor Martina Tazzioli about the method used, specifically when it comes to connecting those genealogies of struggles historically. Where did you see this? Was it like talking to them? Were they talking about previous struggles? How did you manage to actually grasp this connection between different struggles, and what kind of methodology or method did you use? Also, I think it's important in the sense of connecting struggles historically and geographically as well. Right? How did you manage to do that? Very curious. Thank you.
So I can tell you what I did in the book, right? Because I think, of course, there might be many other challenges, but in the book I speak about this, like, for me, very interesting case of mobilization at the French-Italian border, solidarity movement at the Alpine border, where the people who mobilized in support of migrants in transit, both on the French and on the Italian side, really like kind of remember previous struggles against the high-speed train, the not-have movement that started in the 90s, but also for previous struggles for like social justice and for against the construction of other infrastructure. And at the same time, there is this like vivid memory of a rescue operation on the mountain rescue, and they started their pro-migrants politics, not from a no-border perspective, but by saying we are driven by this Alpine humanitarian principle according to which nobody should be left to die on the mountain. And so we also, of course, rescue migrants today. And building on that, in the last 5 years, they became, right, many of them at least, not everyone, of course,